Namaste. Welcome to Yes Talks. The title of today's session is Does Past Record of Empires Make the Idea of a World Government Ridiculous? This shall be based on Sri Aurobindo's work, The Ideal of Human Unity. We have with us today Dr. Ramesh Bijlani as the speaker. Dr. Ramesh Bijlani is a prolific writer and an inspirational speaker. He loves to use the gift of communication that he has received from the divine for dispensing small doses of love and wisdom from the inexhaustible pharmacy of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Once a professor at AIIMS New Delhi, Dr. Bijlani is now a spiritual seeker at Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to an interesting session with you.
Thank you, Arunima. My dear brothers and sisters, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you. If we look at the creation of the Creator as it has manifested on earth, we find two opposing tendencies. The tendency to assert individuality and at the same time a hidden desire as if to also form groups or aggregates. An atom asserts its identity, wants to stay as an independent element, and yet we find that it forms aggregates with other atoms, somewhat being choosy in the atoms that it chooses, and forms molecules. And in order to be able to form those aggregates, the molecules, it is willing to sacrifice its individuality, at least to some extent. A striking example is that of hydrogen and oxygen, two elements coming together to form the compound water. Hydrogen is a combustible substance, and oxygen supports combustion. But then when the two combine, they both lose their identity. They have nothing to do with combustion. We get water, which is actually a fire extinguisher. So that is the beauty of this tendency, the tendency to form aggregates. And the same thing happens all the way up to human beings. Every human being wants to live uh, in keeping with his own personal preferences, his ideas, opinions, likes and dislikes, goals and aspirations in life. One would like his life to be organized entirely around these. And yet, realizing that's also necessary to form relationships with others, the individual is willing to surrender, sacrifice some of this individuality in order to be able to form part of a group. And that is what we find all along. And if we look at something fundamental at the root of all these groups, thinkers and visionaries have realized that that should not be really difficult to form not only small but very large aggregates. The aggregates don't have to be just in terms of the family or the neighborhood or a association based on a professional link or even a nation. So it doesn't have to be confined to that, because at the root of all these is the fact that, after all, we are all human beings. And if we are all human beings, we should be able to form some sort of an aggregate which includes all of us. And if it has to have a machinery supporting it, a mechanism that gives effect to it, then it could be a world government. At least one problem will be solved. There'll be no boundary disputes. What we look upon as nations today will actually become provinces or states within that large country called the world. So that is the idea behind this. However ridiculous it may look, unless somebody visualizes such ideals, and there have been individuals, few and far between, who have in fact not only visualized it, but taken it seriously and tried to sort of suggest how it could happen. Whether it's Sri Aurobindo or Bertrand Russell or some other thinkers and visionaries and spiritual masters, they have actually given a serious consideration to this idea. And we shall today try and explore it in light of Sri Aurobindo's work, The Ideal of Human Unity. So, with this little introduction, I'll go to the PowerPoint. So, this work on which today's session is based, The Ideal of Human Unity, forms a part of volume 25 in the collected works of Sri Aurobindo. Along with this, there are two other works in this volume 25, The Human Cycle, which we discussed a few weeks ago, and a small work which may be considered as sort of an appendix to this, these two big major works, The Human Cycle and The Ideal of Human Unity, is War and Self-Determination. And to some extent, these three are interrelated. And while talking primarily on the basis of the ideal of human unity, I'll also bring in some passages and some discussion based on the smaller work on the war and self-determination. And one can understand why it is so, why, I mean, all these three are grouped together, and uh, why it had to be sort of not only written from 1915 to 1918, primarily in the area. In this case, there were some attempts made at revision, and when that could not happen on a large scale, then Sri Aurobindo tried to add a preface here or a postscript chapter there, or write something later on, which got published separately as an article. And this process went on till about 1920. That happened because that was a period during which remarkable developments were taking place on the international scene. The First World War, 1914 to 1918. And then uh, the events that followed the formation of the League of Nations. Now, and in fact, Sri Aurobindo also kept track of the failure of the League of Nations and the birth of the United Nations organization. And on that, again, he wrote something which has also been included in this work, volume 25. So that's how, you get a idea of the scene as well evolving and how it was shaping Sri Aurobindo's vision of the future. Yeah, but then we know that behind all this, there's a very broad vision which unites everything that Sri Aurobindo has written, and that is the evolutionary thrust plus individual effort at spiritual growth will soon result in the upward shift of the average level of human consciousness, and that will change human nature. Instead of being primarily ego driven, then the average human being will become love driven, and that will not only change human nature, it's understandable, it will also change the character of the world. The world will become a much better place to live in. That, in fact, will be the ultimate solution to all the problems of human existence, such as inequality, injustice, cruelty, misery, and suffering. And when that happens, the ideal of human unity will be very easy to realize. So that is what fits in the ideal of human unity within that broader vision of the evolution leading to a change in the level of human consciousness, which in turn will change human nature. So there is this contrast between individuality and grouping. We want to remain individual and have the freedom to live according to our own ideas, opinions, likes and dislikes, and aims and aspirations. And yet, we also have a tendency to form groups because we find that there is a certain advantage to that. And this is what Sri Aurobindo has talked about in this quote from The Ideal of Human Unity. In the relations between the individual and the group, this constant tendency of nature appears as the strife between two equally deep rooted human tendencies. Both are equally deep rooted: individualism and collectivism. On one side is the engrossing authority, perfection, and development of the state. The state here signifying the nation or a large aggregate, which today we take as something sacrosanct, that the largest unit, which is respectable, is the nation, and state sometimes used synonymously with the nation. So, on one side is the engrossing authority, perfection, and development of the state, and on the other the distinctive freedom, perfection, and development of the individual man. And both have their importance because we do require a powerful center to keep the aggregate in place. And at the same time, it should not have such overarching control over individual lives that individuals do not have this freedom to develop along their own nature, the way they are constituted. And this is particularly important for the out of the ordinary, idealistic, and creative individuals. Because if they do not have this freedom, uh, they will not be able to lead to further progress because progress depends upon these individuals getting encouragement and support and opportunities, and as a result inspiring others, their number growing, and eventually leading to progress of the society as a whole. So these individuals may be few, but they are important and they should be able to enjoy that freedom. So both these are important, and the ideal arrangement would be one in which we have the benefits of collectivism, forming an aggregate, and also the benefits of this individual development along the lines that that person is best suited for. The oldest aggregates were rather small, and even now we have small nations. Sometimes the nation consists of just one city, like Singapore. And on the other hand, we have large nations like India, China, and the United States. So we have a large variation. But to start with, all over the world, it seems that the aggregates were what were called clans and tribes. And these were rather small units. Therefore, the people living in those clans or tribes were relatively homogeneous. Homogeneous in terms of the language that they spoke, the food that they ate, the religious rituals, ceremonies, and beliefs and faiths that they had, and the ideas and opinions that they had. In all these respects, they were rather homogeneous because it was a small group, and communication with adjacent groups were limited because of not the type of communication that we have today through the internet and all that. So these groups were relatively homogeneous, and this homogeneity led to a certain psychological unity amongst them. Now, this is at the base of all aggregates. All aggregates, in fact, become stable only if there is a certain psychological unity among those who are constituting it. Without that, there'll always be a tendency to split, to form smaller units, which will be more homogeneous. So these units were already small, relatively homogeneous, and those who were a part of these units had a remarkable psychological unity because of this homogeneity. And forming these groups was obviously socially useful because then they could have not only family life, they could have marriages within those groups, and uh, social interactions, celebration of festivals. Now all these things were possible without any contradictions, without any conflicts, because the population was relatively homogeneous, and therefore this type of association in these aggregates was socially useful. It was also economically beneficial because then they could engage in different trades and engage in some sort of a barter, which was convenient to everybody, or after currency was devised, use money to have those exchanges. So they could be, they were found that this was also economically beneficial. And for the ruler also, it was easy because it was a small homogeneous unit, which in any case had a tendency to stick together because of this psychological unity. So administratively, it was convenient for whosoever was ruling that clan or the tribe, and therefore it was politically stable. But there's always a but in life. And what happened was two types of collective egos. The collective egos of this relatively homogeneous population within the tribe or clan, feeling that the neighboring clan or tribe is somehow inferior to us. So, if you have two neighboring clans or tribes, each of them felt that the neighboring ones are inferior to us in this way or that way. And you can always find some reasons for being superior, neglecting those in the ways in which you are inferior, or in fact, there may be not even a superiority or inferiority. It may be just two different ways of living. And we have a tendency to consider that our way of living or our way of thinking is the superior one. So the collective ego of the clan or the tribe, and then the individual ego of the ruler. The ruler was not satisfied with this kingdom, which was politically stable and administratively convenient. If only I could also rule over the neighboring clan or tribe, I'll have a bigger kingdom. So, that egoistic desire to rule over not just the present set of people, but a larger number of people. So, the egoistic desires of the ruler and the collective egos of the people feeling that we are superior to the neighboring one meant that if the ruler felt I'm powerful enough to attack the neighbor and win the war, he attacked the neighbor. So there were natural differences in their strength in terms of fighting a war, and very often they fought the war, won it, and then annexed the uh, neighboring clan or tribe and became a bigger unit. But then as a result of this fusion, it was inevitable that now that aggregate that formed was less homogeneous because two different types of clans or tribes, which were homogeneous in themselves, were now part of a bigger aggregate. So there was less homogeneity, and therefore, as a result, there was less psychological unity. And also, there was therefore less of social cohesiveness. And for the ruler, therefore, it was administratively less convenient, and politically, it was less stable. So, in short, greater the diversity within the aggregate, less is the viability of the aggregate. And what was the result? The result of this was that very often this larger aggregate collapsed because it was not viable because of too much diversity. But then there were ways of making its life prolonged. That also we shall see. But essentially, therefore, it means that in any aggregate, there are centripetal forces dependent upon homogeneity, which tend to keep it together, and centrifugal forces which tend to split it, break it into smaller units because of the differences, because of this psychological disunity or psychological differences. Or one may say that the optimum size of a human aggregate depends upon the balance between diversity and viability. The two are reciprocally related. Greater the diversity, less the viability, less the diversity, greater the viability of the unit. So, how viable the unit will be, how long it will continue to survive, uh, would depend upon whether its size is optimum, and the optimum size depends upon these two factors. Now, it is through this process that nations also evolved. These are rather large aggregates, but of course, there's a great variety. As I said, among nations also, you have very small countries like Singapore, and you have very big countries like India or China or the US. But at the same time, what unites them is that they're all relatively large aggregates with a strong center. And the formation of the nation goes through typically three stages, Sri Aurobindo says, which one might describe as the we versus they stage, blow hot, blow cold stage, and the stage of consolidation and sanctification. Let's see what these three stages are. The first stage is the unstable phase, the we versus they phase, in which the units which have been united together to form the nation as a result of a military conquest, the units still continue to feel that we have been united because of the powerful army that the ruler has, because of he could conquer us, but basically we are different from our neighbor. So technically, they may be states within the larger nation, but they continue to feel that we are different from the other state, and it is only by force that we have been made to join each other to form one single nation. So it is the we versus they phase, and therefore there's no psychological unity between the aggregates. And therefore, there may be some sort of a cold war going on between them. They can't fight an open war because the center is rather strong, but there remains that undercurrent of conflicts and tension because of this feeling that we are superior to the other states which have been forced to join us in this formation of this nation. And this Cold War may eventually lead to a real war between the neighbors and the collapse of the nation into smaller bits, or it may lead to some sort of a coexistence. Now, that will depend partly on the strategy that the ruler adopts. And let's see what that strategy is. That strategy has two phases. One is the blow hot, blow cold strategy, and the second is consolidation and sanctification. Now, let's see what these two stages are, which have led to formation of relatively stable nations. The stabilizing phase is the blow hot, blow cold. This is the type of policy this is how you may describe the policy of the ruler. First thing is he takes away much of the liberties which individual units have. And the diversity is denied. And uniformity, an attempt is made to impose uniformity on all of them. The ruler feels, sometimes justifiably, sometimes as a necessity, that I have to, that sometimes the ruler feels that I could conquer the other neighboring uh, areas because I am superior, my culture is superior, and therefore it is my duty to impose the superior culture on all of them for their own good. But he may also feel that I have the authority, and therefore to be able to consolidate the country, since it is necessary that there should not be that much diversity. So he may deny the diversity and try to impose some sort of a uniformity by force. And at the same time, he is intelligent enough to work on two other fronts. He tries to develop a national consciousness. He tries to repeat again and again. And if you repeat again and again, it starts sounding true, it starts having a psychological impact. That we may be different. There may be some basic differences, but basically we are all part of a nation. And together we stand, divided we fall. So he tries to develop a national consciousness and also a national conscience that this nation is a sacred unit, and therefore to go against this formation would be in some way profane, immoral, and wrong to do. So he starts developing a national consciousness and a national conscience while reducing the liberties to a minimum and allowing diversity much less than probably the diversity deserves. So, and on in sort of in contrast with letting that diversity flourish, he tries to impose some sort of a uniformity. So this is the stabilizing phase. But then after some stability has been achieved, he'll be able to prolong the life of this nation as a unit by going to the next phase, during which it will be stable, when some of the liberties will be restored. So people will be happy. You know, if liberties are restored after being denied for some time, they'll be valued all the more. Same happens in case of diversity. Diversity will be glorified, and the axiom now will be to sing this song repeatedly: "Unity in diversity." This will be made an axiom, and the result will be, by glorifying this diversity, richness will be added to unification. So actually, it will become a more rich country. Rich means rich in terms of its culture and cultural expressions such as language, music, art, dance, architecture, theater, everything, literature. So in all these areas, it will actually become a more imposing, more impressive country, a better country, so that richness will be added to this unification. So that is the stable phase. And that is what, so the consolidation has taken place, and it has been made to a sort of a sacred entity that, well, smaller units than that are somehow fissiparous, divisive, and unholy. But then division between one country and the next, which is demarcated by a national boundary, that is sacred. There's no problem with having division compared to the neighboring country. So the uh, sacred boundary is between two nations. That is the type of feeling that we have grown up with in this present era. So that is the nation state, as it is called. So it has, so typically nations have gone through these three phases. But all the same, we must realize that while all this sounds very good and very realistic, and that is how we feel that today's world is constituted in terms of nations, which are considered the sacred unit, it is still an arbitrary unit. God did not draw those lines which divide one country from the other. So it's still an arbitrary unit. And it's a pragmatic compromise, trying to achieve some sort of a compromise between diversity and viability. As we saw, that basic principle still applies even to the nation. And it is sanctified by a commitment, the way you have a commitment to, say, follow a certain religion. So that sort of a commitment is created also towards the country. And somehow nationalism or patriotism, considering your country to be the better than any other country, defending the boundaries of the country, these are all elevated to the level of ideals which are beyond question. So that is what a nation is. But then, as we see that this is, since this is an arbitrary unit, there's no real reason why one cannot go in for aggregates which are even larger than a nation. And that is what empires are about. So if we extend this process, we come to empires. And empires have also are also a part of history. There have been so many of them. And by and large, these empires were created through military conquest. And after this conquest had been achieved, the conqueror exploited the countries that he conquered, which form now units in the empire, economically and in many other ways, and also tries to impose the culture of the conqueror on the constituent units of the empire, which means that the process was quite different from the process in the formation of a nation. Here, probably the rulers realized that the empire will not continue forever. It is destined to fall. But then make hay while the sun shines. uh, Luto the conquered nations as much as you can, exploit them economically, impoverish them, and make yourself richer so that when the empire falls, the conqueror is still in a much better shape economically. It has grown rich at the expense of the units that it has conquered. And at least by cultural imposition, it thought the empire may be conquered, but my culture will be left behind. So these people, that is how, that's what happened in India. It's a very sort of recent example. When Macaulay wrote the Minutes of Education, he was very clear that the empire will not last for long. But before we leave, we should create in this country a small group of influential people, people who will continue to sort of be in the positions of power in this country. We should create that type of a class who may be brown in color, but will be European at heart. And we can see how eminently successful they were in leaving behind this culture. So, you know, the next to making the empire last long was this desire to impose one's culture, sometimes genuinely believing that their culture was superior and therefore doing a service to those who had been conquered, sometimes because of ignorance. But this feeling was sometimes very genuine. And that's what Macaulay wrote, without knowing how much ancient Indian literature existed. He said that all the ancient Indian literature probably can be fitted into one little shelf in a library in Europe. That's all that they have. And they felt that, well, even that little that they have is something which seemed to be the products of some barbarians, and God has sent us to this country, India, to civilize them. So that was the genuine impression that some of them had. Leave aside some scholars who took much greater interest in Indian scriptures and ancient Indian literature, studied Sanskrit, translated those books into English, and uh, had great respect for us, for our culture. But then the average Britisher, and to some extent the average person in the West, had a very poor image of India. And in a way, Swami Vivekananda was a pioneer in the sense that it was with him that we can say there was a milestone which led to a change in the image that this country had in the West, when he went and spoke at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. So that was the beginning of a change in the image that India had. But then this cultural imposition by the conqueror was common to empires in general. And there, this follows that, therefore, there was no real attempt at achieving a psychological unity amongst all the countries that had been conquered. In short, it was a short sighted approach. Make hay while the sun shines. The empire will not last forever, but there can be some lasting effects which are beneficial. The conqueror can grow rich, leave the conquered countries poor. That's what happened. When before we were conquered, we were the most prosperous economy in the world. By the time the British left, we were amongst the poorest countries in the world. So impoverish them and leave behind your culture. Kill their culture, maim their culture, if not kill. Indian culture was too good to be killed. It never died, but they left it rather maimed and crippled. That they succeeded in doing. And so that is what empires were about. And these were also the reasons why empires eventually fell. because the type of consolidation process that went into the formation of nations did not apply to empires. They didn't follow the same process. Probably the unit was too big for that type of a process to be applied. So the empire, Sri Aurobindo, has very dispassionately looked at the advantages as well as the disadvantages of empires and used the Roman Empire as an example. Roman Empire was a very powerful empire which lasted about 7 centuries, starting from the beginning, more or less the beginning of the Christian era, till the 7th century AD was the Roman Empire. And the advantages of this were that it had admirable organization. Peace reigned over the region. There was no wars between the constituent units, naturally, because they were now part of the same empire, and people felt secure. There was great orderliness and material well being. And as a result of all this, they did produce some things of lasting value, like the Roman law, which forms the basis of the legal system in much of the civilized world even today. Although Roman Empire fell in the 7th century, uh, even 1500 years later today, the legal system, the laws in much of the civilized world are based on Roman law. And another thing from the field of medicine, the hospital system, that also evolved under Roman law. But then what were the disadvantages of the empire? The disadvantages were that the individual and individual regions lost their individuality. So the individuality of not only the individuals, but individual regions was also lost. They all became part of a machine. The empire was like that machine of which they all became a part. And the result was that life lost its color, richness, variety, freedom, and creativity. Yes, creativity, that's very important. Because if you look at if you compare the Greek civilization, uh, which was, say, about 400 BC, till the growth of the Roman Empire, about 400 years, 400 years during which we had all these great thinkers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and in the field of medicine, Hippocrates, they all belong to that period. There was a remarkable growth in literature, remarkable growth in different philosophical systems which were devised, and growth in science and technology to the extent it was possible in that era, and great transfer of knowledge from distant lands. Greek medicine was deeply influenced by Indian and Chinese medicine. They took quite a bit from here. They traveled long distances to take it there. So there was a lot of give and take in spite of limited means of transport and communication across long distances. And all this was because individual curiosity, urge to learn, urge to know, the urge to create, the urge to explore, that was respected during the Greek civilization. And then came the Roman Empire. The Greek civilization went down. All these countries, Europe and a part of the Middle East, they became part of the Roman Empire. But then, as we saw, in the empire, this type of individuality is not respected. And the result was that with 700 years and lot of prosperity at its disposal, Roman Empire did not generate much of science. Whatever science had developed till the beginning of the Roman Empire, they could not create any real science. And from the field of medicine with which I am familiar, medicine stood static at the level of where the Greek civilization left it at 1 AD. And 7 AD was essentially the same, but one thing did happen, and that was Galen, in Greek called Galenus, but in English we write it Galen, commonly called Galen. He was a wise man and also an intelligent man. Intelligent because he collected all the knowledge in medicine that was available till then and prepared books which brought it all at one place. I think around 80 volumes he wrote. But then he was basically a synthesizer and also wise because in order to have this freedom to be able to do this voluminous work in which he was interested, he ingratiated himself with the king. So he was close to the rulers so that he'll be able to work in peace without getting disturbed because individuality otherwise was not respected. So he ingratiated himself with the king and did this work in peace, but it was basically a synthesis, not generation of new knowledge. But then after that came the Dark Ages, and during Dark Ages, authority came to have a large influence on thinking. And the result was that when the Roman Empire fell in the 7th century, and before the European Renaissance came in the 16th century, for nearly 1,000 years, Western medicine stood at the level where Galen left it at 7 AD in those 80 volumes. That is where medicine stood stationary. Not only stood stationary, during this dark ages, there is a great respect that develops for authority and you cannot question it easily. That's one of the characteristics of the dark ages or the age of convention, as we might say in Sri Aurobindo's terminology. We talked about it last time when we talked about the human cycle. So the result was that Galen wielded great authority for even 1,000 years after he had died. And the result was that when during European Renaissance, people like Vesalius actually dissected the cadavers to see what anatomy was like, or Harvey did experiments on circulation to see how blood circulated in the body, they were very afraid to talk about their findings because their findings were different from what Galen had written. Anatomy in many, what Vesalius found was quite different from what Galen had written, and the circuit of circulation was quite different from what Galen had written in those 80 volumes. And sometimes they had to wait for 10, 20, 30 years and look for an opportunity and still uh, take the risk of getting persecuted if they said something which Galen had not said. So that is the disadvantage of an empire like this, where you have a great deal of consolidation. You can have admirable organization and material well being, but since individuality and individual freedom is not respected, not only color, richness, variety, and freedom is lost, creativity is also lost, including scientific creativity. So it's not that for 1,000 years there was no intelligent person born in Europe. Hmm? One can't believe that. But no scientific development took place. Essentially, science stood where it was. So this is what Sri Aurobindo sums up after enumerating these advantages and disadvantages. The organization is great and admirable, but the individual dwindles and is overpowered and overshadowed. Something similar to what happens in a joint family. The family is very stable, but there's no individual growth. If there are three daughters-in-law in the family, and one of them says that I do not want to gossip the whole day, except when I am cooking, uh, she'll be considered the odd one out. So if the rest of them are gossiping about what somebody is doing or not doing, what the neighbors are doing, what the neighbors have and we don't have, and what we have and the neighbors don't have, and whose son or daughter is falling in love with whose son or daughter, unless they are gossiping about all this the whole day, she will be considered the odd one out. If the other two daughters-in-law are doing it, she also has to do it, even if she doesn't want to. So there's no individual growth, but the family is very stable. So that's what happens at the family level, and that's what happens also at the level of empires. And while talking about this benefit of the organization, Sri Aurobindo organization, that the organization is admirable, but individual dwindles and is overpowered and overshadowed. Sri Aurobindo also sort of talked about the advantages and disadvantages both. So here he says the huge organism inevitably and slowly loses even its great conservative vitality and dies of an increasing stagnation. Even while outwardly whole and untouched, the structure has become rotten. Now, it's something like getting eaten up by those little white ants. When white ants have eaten up the furniture, on the surface it looks quite all right. Even while outwardly whole and untouched, the furniture may look very nicely whole and polished, but just a little blow, and you realize that it has become hollow inside. So same happens to the empires for quite some time till they suddenly collapse. They may appear outwardly whole and untouched. The structure has become rotten because of this lack of freedom and diversity, because of not encouraging diversity. The structure has become rotten and begins to crack and dissolve at the first shock from outside. The shock may come from the constituent units who start fighting for their freedom, the way the British Empire collapsed. India fought its freedom, and so did so many other units. So it may, or the first shock from outside, as happened in the case of the Roman Empire, to some extent it was because of the beginnings of the Arabian Empire. After the founding of Islam, the Arabian Empire started expanding, and that probably was the shock that made the Roman Empire collapse. It was hollow from inside, just needed that first shock from the outside, and that's what made it collapse. But then here Sri Aurobindo talks about the advantages in this quote. Such organizations that like empires, such periods are immensely useful for conservation, even as the Roman Empire served to consolidate the gains of the rich centuries that preceded it. So the rich centuries that preceded it was the Greek civilization. Those 4 centuries or so, from 400 BC to 1 AD, that was those 400 years preceded it, and the gains of that period could be consolidated the way I said in the field of medicine. Galen did it by writing those 80 volumes, but they arrest life and growth. And then what is the advantage of this consolidation? At least in the field of medicine with which I'm familiar, I can tell you what the advantage of this consolidation, which Galen did, in spite of the fact that it created some difficulties in among those who the scientists who came up during the European Renaissance to express themselves because of the overarching authority that Galen wielded on the conventional mind. But it did serve a purpose. The purpose that it served was that as the Arabian Empire grew, there came there also grew Arabian medicine, and the father of Arabian medicine was Avicenna, uh, called in that local language Abu il Sina or something, but in English generally pronounced as Avicenna. And what these Arabian medical people did was to travel uh, to places like Rome, where they got hold of what Galen had written, and they also traveled to India and China. From there, they got Greek medicine, the way Galen had left it, and the way it had been translated into Latin probably by him. He had written it in the language which was the language of the Roman Empire, Latin. So they got those Latin translations, and they took the Ayurvedic texts from India and some texts from Chinese medicine, who in turn had also taken it from Ayurveda. And I said the Greeks also had taken Ayurveda, and that's what was the root of Greek medicine. So in a way, it was all the origin was all in Ayurveda. But during that period in history, the fact is that they took what they got in those latent translations by Galen and what they got from India and China, put it all together, and that was the formation of the Unani system of medicine. So they did come up. But then interestingly, like the Roman Empire, the Arabian Empire also did not really generate any new knowledge. So they also ended up consolidating. They consolidated it for another 1,000 years till the European Renaissance. During the Dark Ages, when Europe was going through the Dark Ages, that knowledge was consolidated. But then it was consolidated through the double disaster of true translations from Greek to Latin and from Latin to Persian. But in spite of this double translation and the disaster it leads to, enough survived for the Western medicine to once again pick up from there during the European Renaissance and take it further. And we see what a remarkable growth took place in science and technology in general, including medicine, in just a short, relatively short period of about 400 years, from the 16th century to the 20th century. So such organizations, such periods are immensely useful for conservation. So we saw how this conservation is useful. It helps in consolidating the gains of the rich centuries that preceded it, but they arrest life and growth. Now, how about the League of Nations and the United Nations? These were again efforts at achieving, without compromising the uh, individual freedom of nations, to have some sort of an understanding between nations all over the world. That is what these attempts represented. And let's have a good look at, a brief look at these. Now, what Sri Aurobindo says regarding how the League of Nations came into being is that we cannot do without some kind of a futurist idealism. So, and this idealism actually is more likely to develop after going through a difficult phase. The World War was a difficult phase, the First World War from 1914 to 1918. And that is what generated, amongst at least a select few, this idealism that the future should not be so bad. In future, we should have no wars. Let this World War One be the last war that human beings have fought. So it was with this idealism that they said, well, nations can have their individual identities, but there can be some sort of an association of these nations so that they are able to resolve their disputes in a peaceful way. This organization should be able to help them do that. So that was the basis of this of birth of the League of Nations. It better that it should have the ideal of a saving machinery than that it should have no ideal at all, no figure of a larger, better, and sweeter life. So although this idealism may appear unrealistic and impractical, still it's better to have the ideal than not to have it. And some people will have that type of idealism always. Now let's see the background of the League of Nations. The background was the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and the League of Nations was founded on the 10th of January 1920, soon after that at Paris. But then the uh, process of forming it started when the World War One was about to come to an end. That is when it started, and the treaty for the League of Nations was signed on the 10th of January 1928 at Paris. Then, what was the legacy, Sri Aurobindo says, of the League of Nations? Legacy of hatred, reprisals, ambitions, and revolutions, including the Russian Revolution. And what all is dependent upon? Basically on one individual. The determination of one idealistic statesman, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the US from 1913 to 1921. And for some reasons, which may be partly political, he was given a commanding position because of the circumstances by the other strong countries that emerged from the First World War. The countries that emerged the strongest, they and the United States put together were behind the formation of the League of Nations. So essentially, it was five powerful nations and their allies. Which were these five powerful nations? The United States itself, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. So these five powerful nations and those who were friendly with them, naturally they joined, and their allies. That is what formed the League of Nations. And what was hoped from it was that there'll be no more wars in the world. All disputes will be resolved without clash, strife, or collision. War is a type of a collision, direct, head-to-head collision. To resolve disputes by cooperation, arbitration, and mutual accommodation, and ordered legality, some sort of an international law in the world affairs, and to deal with human trafficking. So some social evils were also looked at, child labor and slavery, to try and abolish these in the world, and to guarantee liberty and human unity. All beautiful things. But then, what were the lacunae that Sri Aurobindo saw in the League of Nations? And the conditions that should have been fulfilled if it had to fulfill its goals. All countries of the world should have joined. They did not. And this is again expected. All countries will not join. The most glaring exception was the United States, which did not join. It was the president of the US who was behind it, but the US itself did not join because the Senate of the US did not approve it. So, through the democratic process, we could not convince the Senate, and the balance was such of the different parties that he could not get it through the Senate, and therefore the US could not join. And that became one of the reasons, perhaps, why the League of Nations collapsed. All countries of the world should have joined. Laws were made by those who were the strongest then. On the other hand, the laws should have been based on some evolvable, that is, something which evolves and changes with times, on evolvable principles of equity and justice, rather than give all the power for making the laws to those who were the strongest at that time. There should have been a system established so that there's a trustworthy means for the solution of problems that arise, and a strong central authority acceptable to all. In fact, the strong authority acceptable to all was just these five countries, out of which one did not join, so they were left behind only four. That was the strong authority, and they decided that nothing should be able to pass through this unless all four of us are unanimous. It was not by majority, but by unanimity that it passed, because none of them wanted that they should not be able to prevail. So in a way, the four put together had a veto power. No idealistic, Sri Aurobindo says that these conditions which he thinks should have been fulfilled are not idealistic demands. They are practical necessities if the League of Nations has to fulfill its goals. And true enough, it did not fulfill its goals. But all the same, here is the picture of President Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the US behind the formation of League of Nations. And you can understand that he was not a typical politician. He was a statesman because he had the background of an academic. For a long period, he had served as the professor of history and therefore was very familiar with the details of history of the world, particularly of the Western countries, and the professor of political science, which means that he was not an amateur even when it came to politics as it works. So it was this combined with his idealism that made him determined to get it through. And of course, he was rewarded with a Nobel Prize for Peace in 1919. Now, here is a cartoon which was made uh, when the Senate declined to give the consent. The US Senate, here's the Lady Justice, saying the US Senate, here's the US Senate, in this powerful position, the US Senate stands accused by humanity for killing the Versailles Treaty. That was this treaty was called the treaty which gave birth to the League of Nations. So the League of Nations became ineffective, and one more war did take place, the World War II, 1939 to 1944. And learning from the mistakes that the League of Nations had made, some of the mistakes were corrected, and an improved version was floated in the form of the United Nations organization. So that is what UNO is, generally called just the UN, which continues to this day. But then UN has also not been as effective as one might expect it to, or as its mandate would say, in preventing armed conflicts. But one difference that is there, this basic difference between the UN and the League of Nations, is that the League of Nations did not have its own peacekeeping force. The UN does have. So now if empires fell, the League of Nations failed, UN is not effective enough, why talk about something like a world government, which is a far more ambitious dream? But then, as Sri Aurobindo said that it's better to have an ideal than not to have it at all, even if it appears unrealistic. And here is what he says, that in fact, because of that evolutionary thrust, that type of an ideal is nearing its realization. Today, the ideal of human unity is more or less vaguely making its way to the front of our consciousness. It may be expressed by only a few, but he could see that this is an ideal which is growing, and its vibrations can be felt in the atmosphere of the earth. It is making way to the front of the human consciousness, the ideal of human unity. And the emergence of an ideal in human thought is always the sign of an intention of nature. So the natural intention is to work towards further evolution of consciousness, and it is a sign of that. And that is why this thought has been put in the human mind, who is the most creative instrument that nature has produced so far, who can collaborate with nature in carrying the evolution further. So the emergence of an idea in human thought is always the sign of an intention of nature, but not always of an intention to accomplish. Doesn't mean that that ideal will actually be accomplished by human beings or very soon. Sometimes it indicates only an attempt which is predestined to temporary failure. The way empires collapsed, League of Nations failed, United Nations is not effective enough, but these are all a part of attempts which are probably predestined to temporary failure, but they still serve a purpose. The way the empires did in the same way, League of Nations and the United Nations would have also served a purpose. And the nature is not in a hurry. The divine has eternity at its disposal, for nature is slow and patient in her methods. It is prepared for these temporary failures. It's only we human beings who are in a great hurry. Why didn't it happen immediately? Huh? Why, in spite of it, we are continuing to fight and so on and so forth? That's the human way of looking at it. Nature is slow and patient in her methods. Now, let's look at the basic things which are behind this idea of a world government. That the human unity is an ideal which is the foundation of world government. And the ideal of human unity is based on three ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity. In fact, these three were the ideals also of the French Revolution. But then it was premature because democracies did end up giving some liberties, but it was at the expense of equality. The communist government did try to achieve some semblance of equality, but only by taking away liberties. And this happened because fraternity was nowhere to be seen. Fraternity is something which cannot come except at the spiritual level, because it's only at the spiritual level that we are genuinely one. And it is that feeling of oneness that leads to that love, which in turn gets expressed as that universal brotherhood and sisterhood, which we call fraternity. And when that happens, liberty and equality will automatically follow, because if that fraternity is there, I can't keep myself free and have my brothers and sisters in chains, which means liberty is automatically guaranteed. And I cannot be well fed and keep my brothers and sisters hungry, which means equality is automatically guaranteed. So if there's true fraternity, liberty and equality will automatically follow. But all the same, these are the three ideals on which human unity also rests. The individuals within that unity should still have that liberty to be free individuals, to be able to follow their own creativity, not at the expense of the collective, but same time reasonable freedom to be able to express their individuality and creativity and the capacity for human progress that they should be able to express. And of course, there should be equality, because that is something basic which emerges from human unity. If we are all human, then why are we not all equal? So these are all important ideals on which human unity rests and which should form the foundations of a world government. Governments are only a mechanism for giving shape to ideals, and the world government can be that mechanism for giving shape to these ideals. Governments have tried to give a shape to liberty and equality, as I said, democracy to liberty and communism to equality. To some extent, socialism has tried to do both, but all these attempts have succeeded to a very limited extent at all, because fraternity has actually been missing. And that is because of the present level of human consciousness. And it is that which we can hope from the change in the average level of human consciousness, which is around the corner. So, in light of what we have talked, we can see that the basic essentials for a world government are a psychological unity and not uniformity, but in fact celebrating diversity. We should not try to enforce uniformity. So these are the two essentials for a world government, not the type of uniformity which empires tried to impose on the constituent units. And Sri Aurobindo says that if psychological unity is the key to a world government, the road to psychological unity, in spite of diversity, passes through a spiritual religion of humanity. Essentially, what he says is rooted in spirituality instead of all the religions that we have had so far. So the world should move away from religions towards spirituality, and that is a part of the vision of the future that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother had. That the world will move away from all religions towards spirituality. Here, religion means basically dharma, the sense of right and wrong, based on a spiritual worldview. That is what is called here in this particular work a spiritual religion of humanity. A spiritual religion of humanity is the hope of the future. By this is not meant what is ordinarily called a universal religion, that is, a religion which everybody will follow, a system, a thing of creed and intellectual belief and dogma and outward rite, that uniformly everybody should follow the same system, the same creed, the same intellectual beliefs, the same dogmas, and perform the same outward rites. That is not what is meant by a spiritual religion of humanity. What it means is basically a genuine sense of oneness with our fellow men, and that should become the leading principle of all our life, not just as a belief, not just as an intellectual uh, belief, not just as acceptance at the mental level, but it should actually become the guiding principle of life and a principle of cooperation, which is at a deeper level, and that is emerging out of brotherhood. So, not just a cooperation which is strategic or opportunistic in nature, or mutually satisfying mutual interests, not that type of a cooperation, but based on deeper brotherhood, which in turn is the result of genuine love, which does not calculate in terms of mutuality and reciprocity. So that is the uh, creed of the future, if one might say, spirituality, and this is what will lead to. And in the language of Savitri, which comes almost towards the end of Savitri, to feel love and oneness is to live. That is, life becomes meaningful, our lives become meaningful. We get that sense of fulfillment in life only if we live a life full of love, which in turn has been inspired by a genuine sense of oneness. So here is what Sri Aurobindo continues, and this will be more or less the end of the session today. No doubt, if this is only an idea, that is, if this world government is only an idea like the rest, it will go the way of all ideas, which means that many ideas have come and gone, and this will also probably come and go. But then this is more than an idea, it is an ideal which has a basis in the deepest truths of existence. And that ideal is close to realization, and that is why it is being put more and more forcefully in human beings. And is, in fact, the intention of nature, as we saw. So, if it is at all the truth of our being, then it must be the truth to which all is moving. And in it must be found the means of a fundamental and inner and a complete and a real human unity, which would be the one secure base of a unification of human life. So, if this is the intention of nature and all is moving, means the world itself is moving in that direction because of the evolutionary thrust, then it is in this direction that we will find the means of a fundamental and inner, a complete, a real human unity, which in turn can be given a practical shape through a world government, which would be the one secure base of a unification of human life. That is what that government, the world government, would be like. So, the idea of a world government is not as ridiculous, as impractical as it looks, in spite of the fact that the record of the empires has not been great, all fallen, and even loose associations like the League of Nations have fallen. But all the same, that should not discourage us, because the way nature is working and the intentions of nature for Earth are quite clear to spiritual masters like Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. These three works, the human cycle, the ideal of human unity, and war and self-determination, together form the 25th volume of the collected works of Sri Aurobindo. And like all the collected works of Sri Aurobindo, this volume is also available as a PDF for free download on the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Puducherry or Pondicherry. And if you want to just get some glimpses, you will find on the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch the old issues of the Call Beyond, which is the ashram's magazine. In the May 2022 issue, you'll find some sort of an overview of the ideal of human unity. And in this recently published book, published by the National Book Trust, The Diary Divine, in which there are passages, 1-page long passages from a large number of works of Sri Aurobindo, you find that there are 16 passages from the ideal of human unity and war and self-determination put together. And of course, you are always welcome to contact me or the YES team on this email, yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making the session possible. And thank you all for being there.
Thank you so much, sir, for this deeply insightful and enlightening session. Participants, if anyone has any question or If you want to share something, please go ahead.
Yeah,
Chidanand sir, hand, please.
thank you. Thank you, Rameshji. I always, try to attend to see your interpretation of any work. It is not only you just represent the work, you also interpret that. That is very unique about you. Thank you very much. I think this is a very, very interesting, topic. I know we're all inspired with the work or what is Arvindo mentioned it. Being from the technology, side where I'm just, curious to know two thoughts from you. One of them may sound paradoxical for myself, and I would like to know from you. Number one is we are talking about the universal and a common, governance or a universe. And even if you look into there is a paradox in the self itself. Everyone to have their own unique identity, but they also want to be social. Okay, that you are talked about in the initial part of the individuality about the collectivity is is that is actually a root cause of all those things whenever we build our empire or thought process on product. Because as a self, I would like to have my own identity too. I would like to identify as myself in whatever the environment I'm in, even though I would like to be, socially one environment. That is actually one question what I have. So whatever we talked about the empires and the nations and all of them, at the end of it is all made up of humans. If the human internally want to have their identity, whatever we build our thought, is always have that particular challenge. Really, what we are thinking about, a spiritual love and oneness and things like that. If humans leave that self and go towards, the spiritual, world, yes, probably it is possible. I'm just thinking about this paradoxical thought. Is it practical to think even about that? That is question number one. If you want, I will ask the question number two now itself. I'll ask later. What is appropriate?
Thank you. Essentially, you have ended up paraphrasing what I had been saying, that this conflict between individuality and the collectivism has always been there. And it depends upon the individual willfully and voluntarily surrendering some of his individuality for the sake of the collectivity. That is the basic principle. But then that is what has been so far, and we have seen that the collective unit has survived only if reasonable individuality has also been permitted within that collective. Now, why we are thinking of larger aggregates like the world government is because the evolutionary thrust is such that we will be able to have that sense of oneness in spite of that individual having greater freedom and individual units having greater freedom, so that diversity would be celebrated. In other words, the differences would be seen, but we will not differentiate because of the differences. We'll continue to have that love for our fellow beings in spite of the differences, which means that the love will become unconditional. It will not depend upon our similarities. The love will not be dependent upon our being similar or the same. It will be there in spite of the differences. So, in that sense, it will be unconditional love.
Thank you. My second comment is any thought about how actually technology is making this happen? I know when this work which is done in early 1900, the technology was not much. We're still looking at the communication itself as a challenging. Now I'll just give an example. The medium in which we are talking, that is one technology. World Wide Web is another technology. I come from the software world. So even though we have some of the governance and the things are, so whatever the work I do, it automatically transfer to my other country place wherever it is. Within 10 minutes, probably I will have a product coming out somewhere else. I'll start using it. So the technology evolution is happening so much, which will bridge this particular, boundaries. What is this? I know we can take an example of the China is little bit rigid compared to all others, but this technology actually is masking that particular, the layer what we have about the countries and things like that. If really that get enhanced, I think whatever we are talking about, one world, country. In fact, we also have a place thought something called a global village. Okay, and so global village, I see, at least I foresee using the technology is evident. It is not that even individually we need to have it, but it is going to happen. It's just a matter of time it's going to happen. So whatever we see the boundaries about some of the rules and regulations, individual countries are doing it. I feel that is very temporary because the evolution is happening so much and we are moving from the independent to so much about the interdependent world. Even, to talk to probably 4 or 5 different countries might have been involved now to make our conversation happening now. So we are so intervened in the interdependent world now. So all these things, border and all those things will just go away. What is Arvindo's talked about in the earlier, it's just a matter of time it's going to come. I can foresee that it's going to happen thanks to technology evolution is that happening.
So I'm glad when you started, you said, how can we make it happen? And you ended with that it is going to happen. So in a way, you have sort of answered this question to some extent. But then the fact is that it is not who can make it happen, but we can facilitate the process. We can collaborate with nature in this evolutionary process. And whether it happens as a result of our tiny efforts or whether there's a divine intervention which sign of divine grace and an expression of nature's intentions in the world. Uh, Either way, that doesn't matter how it happens. But those of us who are able to contribute to this process in our own little ways should still continue to do it, not because that is what will make it happen, but because that will at least guarantee one thing: our own spiritual growth, our own uh, sense of happiness and sense of fulfillment, and the joy which comes from effort and pursuit, not necessarily from accomplishment of a goal. So the goal may or may not happen during our lifetime, that doesn't matter. But the pursuit and the effort itself has its own joy, and it's that we will get. And along with that, of course, our own spiritual growth, which, as we have seen quite often in many of these sessions, helps us in this world be happier and contented. It helps us in going to a better world after we die. And it helps us in getting a head start when we get embodied again on this earth.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Participants, anyone else wants to ask or share something? Okay, so let me quickly inform that the recording of all guest talks and of course today's session will be available on our YouTube channel, Yes Spirituality. Please do visit the channel and explore extensive content on yoga, education, spirituality, and related subjects like psychology and wellness. Thanks once again, Dr. Bijlani, sir, for sparing your valuable time for all of us. And participants, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll close today's session now with a moment of peaceful silence. Namaste.